Thank you, Drew. I am extremely grateful to be here tonight. I'm always thankful for the invitation to come and be with the Asheville Road congregation. As Drew said, there is a special relationship between Decatur Highway and Asheville Road, and that largely because of Drew. I can tell you the folks at Decatur Highway love Drew Kaiser. I'm obligated to invite him to any of our series. I hope he doesn't feel like he's obligated to invite me, and he can get y'all some good speakers from time to time. But they just love Drew so much. We really enjoy having him over there as much as we can. And he was with us not too long ago. Will be with us again this year. And so we look forward to that. And there are a lot of other connections. Cindy Rodabaugh is over here. And of course, her daughter and son-in-law worship with us, and grandkids. Those are the most important ones, not the daughter and son-in-law. I've learned that because I now have a grandchild, and they are really the most important ones. But we love you all. We appreciate you for the work you do here, and I hope that work continues and continues. I understand that Hunter is moving away to Nashville, and I wish him well, and I know he will bless the church up there. And whoever is chosen to take his place here, I know will do a great job as well, and we'll have the great fortune of working with, I think, one of the finest men in this area. So a lot of good things going on and a lot of good things happening here, and I'm grateful to God for that. Jordan, our youth minister, and I were talking earlier today, and we both concurred that Drew may be the cleverest, most creative developer of a series of anybody we know. Anytime Drew calls me and he says, hey, I want you to be on our series, okay, what's your theme? And he'll tell me the theme, and then he'll tell me the topic that he wants. He actually sends you a list of topics and says, okay, pick 3. And then he surprises you with which one you actually get. But I'm always fascinated with the theme, the overall theme, and then the topics that he develops as a part of them. Of course, animals of the Bible is a great theme. The title for this lesson is his, not mine. I left it the way it was, Lockjawed Lions. And what a great title to study Daniel chapter 6. When I first read it, Drew, I was reminded when I was in college as a student, at one of the lectureships, the late Johnny Ramsey was on the lectureship program. Brother Ramsey got up when he began to speak, and he noted that in the audience that day there were men like Franklin Camp and Willard Collins, and he named off several learned, esteemed men in our brotherhood that were sitting in the audience as he was speaking. And I'll never forget, Brother Ramsey made the comment, and I've stolen it and used it many times myself, that he felt like a Daniel in a den of lions. Or a lion in a den of Daniels. I said that backwards. He felt like a lion in a den of Daniels. And I've been there. Sometimes you feel like you just need to shut your mouth and sit down. And after I turn that around, I probably need to do the same thing. But I am extremely grateful to be able to talk to you on this subject tonight. And I hope the things that I have to say to you will be helpful to you. Michael Whitworth, in his book, The Derision of Heaven, says that Daniel and lions goes together like peanut butter and jelly. I mean, when you think of Daniel, don't you think of lions? We all do, and it's an unfortunate thing in reality. I'm convinced most people don't know that the book of Daniel has 12 chapters. They think it has maybe 1 chapter, and if they're really good students of the Bible, maybe they think that it has 6 chapters and it ends after Daniel and the lion's den. Well, it doesn't, and the book of Daniel is a fascinating book to study. And if you've not studied the entirety of the book of Daniel, let me encourage you to do that. It is a beautiful book, and particularly in chapter 7 through 12, you really sort of get a primer, I think, for the book of Revelation. There are a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities in the language, and so I would encourage you to study all of the book of Daniel. But if I really polled you and said, what do you know about the book of Daniel, you probably would talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace, right? We know that. And we also think of Daniel in the lion's den. Maybe if you came up under some of the old school preaching like I did, you know about that statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about, and how that Daniel interpreted that dream for him, representing the 4 empires that would come, ultimately leading to the Roman Empire, in which Jesus would be born and the kingdom of God would find its root. And so those are basically the things we know about the book of Daniel. And another unfortunate side of that is that we've turned at least 2 of those, maybe all 3 of them, into what we call children's Bible stories. Now, you say, why is that unfortunate? It's unfortunate, it's not unfortunate in that we're telling our children these stories, these accounts. But it is unfortunate because what we tend to do with children's Bible stories is we tend to kind of soften them a little bit. You know, you don't want to give your kids the gory details of some of the Bible stories that we have right before they go to bed. And that's very often when we will sit down and try to read a Bible story to them, and then we're going to, let them try to go to sleep. And if you talk about some of the more dangerous things that these individuals went through, they may not sleep very well that night. So we have to soften the edges of the stories. And I think the same thing is true when we talk about the book of Daniel, particularly when we talk about Daniel in the lion's den. We even have a song, don't we? Daniel, 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 Daniel in the lie, Daniel, And so we've cuted it up. I don't know if that's a word or not, but we've cutened it up. Maybe that's the proper way to say it. We've softened it down, and it doesn't have quite the punch, maybe, that it really should have. So what I hope to do tonight is just kind of take us through the chapter a little bit. I'm going to give you 7 key words to walk us through the chapter and look at what the chapter says. And then at the end, I want to give you 5 key lessons I believe that we need to learn from Daniel chapter 6. The point to these stories, and I hesitate a little bit to use the word stories because some people look at that and say, well, stories aren't real. Well, we tell stories about our family, right? We tell stories about something somebody did. Storytelling is a great way of conveying information, and it's been done for centuries, and it was certainly prominent in Hebrew history, and it is prominent in American history as well. So the idea of a story doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true, but we need to tell the story as it really is and realize we're not just telling a story that somebody made up. We're telling a story about something that actually happened. And the point of these stories that we're looking at in the book of Daniel is not to expect God's miraculous intervention in everything that we do. When we face a difficulty, when we face a trial like Daniel and like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that these stories demonstrate God's power, they demonstrate God's mercifulness, they demonstrate God's interest in His people. And when we present ourselves, as Paul says in Romans chapter 12, as living sacrifices, willing to give our life, willing to give our body for God, God is going to bless us in some way. It may not always be with deliverance, and we'll note that a little bit more here as we go through. So let's think about Daniel chapter 6 together. The first word I want to give you tonight is the word promotion. Hunter read for us a few moments ago from Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, where we learned that it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. Now, to understand this a little bit, you have to get the background. Prior to this chapter, going back into chapter 5, you have a huge transition in world history. You have the defeat of one of the greatest nations and one of the greatest armies that has ever set foot on the face of the earth, and that's the Babylonians. You have a transition from Babylonian rule to Medo-Persian rule, because we go from the Babylonians in chapter 5 and Nebuchadnezzar and his descendants into chapter 6, and we're introduced to this Darius, or Darius, according to how you might pronounce that, and we're introduced immediately to the Medo-Persians. Now, the first question you have to ask yourself is, who is this Darius? Who is this man that is identified in the very first verse of the chapter? And it can be a little bit elusive, and I'll admit to you that not all scholars are entirely conclusive as to what they believe about this Darius. One of the problems is we don't have a lot of outside data. We don't have a lot of archaeological information about this man named Darius. Much of what we know, we only know because the Bible tells us so. There is a little bit here and there, but it is not a lot, and that is one of the difficulties that we fall into. Now, some scholars would tell us that Darius is another name for a king by the name of Gubaru. And Gubaru was not necessarily a king, as it were, but he was an under-king. In other words, Cyrus was the actual king over the Medo-Persian Empire. Gubaru was kind of a governor over a particular area, most likely the Babylonian area, where Daniel lived, and thus he was the one that is calling the shots here, the one who was setting these satraps up and placing Daniel into a place of prominence. Now, Cyrus, being the great monarch, appointed Gubaru to this position, and so he still would have had a lot of authority in regard to what was going on. But to me, as I've studied this and as I've looked at it, an explanation that makes a little bit more sense is that the term Darius is not so much of a name as it is a title. We're familiar with the pharaohs. We're familiar with the Caesars. We talk about Moses going into Pharaoh and confronting Pharaoh and the challenges that he had before Pharaoh. And we talk about Pharaoh as if that was his name, but it really wasn't. It was his title. And some information that we have seems to indicate that Darius was much the same way. It was more of a title than it was a name, and so it would seem that perhaps this Darius really is the Cyrus that we read of, who was the king, because as we see these satraps being set up, he not only wanted to make Daniel one of the 3 higher officials over the 120, but he was intent on making Daniel the leader of all of them. He was going to run the country. He was going to be the prime minister. And that was what his intent was to do. The only person that could really do that would have been the king. It wouldn't have been anybody else. It wouldn't have been an underling. It wouldn't have been a governor. It could have only been the king. And so we read in verse 3, "Then this Daniel became distinguished, prospered above all other high officials." And that word distinguished sets up for us an idea. Some of your translations will say that he prospered. And so we see the promotion of Daniel, we see him rising above. And the interesting thing is, because of the transition of empires from the Babylonian Empire into the Medo-Persian Empire, we see Daniel serving faithfully and in a high position under Nebuchadnezzar and his descendants, and then he goes right into the same position under the Medo-Persians. That's unusual. That's rare. And it says something about the person of Daniel. Now, one of the reasons for this, and the text says that Daniel was preferred above everybody else. And the Greek word, or the Aramaic word rather, preferred, is a participle, which means he was distinguishing himself constantly above others. Daniel proved himself. He didn't get what he got because these kings just looked at him and said, well, he's just such a special boy, we're going to do this for him. But he proved himself, and he proved himself primarily because of the grace of God and because of the power that God had given him and the ability that God had given him to govern and to rule and to please these rulers that he was serving under. Now, you also notice that verse 3 says that in him was an excellent spirit. I love that description of Daniel. He had an excellent spirit. We have enough people today that don't have an excellent spirit. If you don't believe that, open Facebook and read a few posts. We've got folks, it seems like they want to argue about anything and everything these days. And they just want to fuss, they want to fight. And that's not just true in the world. Shamefully, I'd have to say it's true of some of my brethren too. And it seems like that's all they're there for, is to argue and to fuss and to fight. And so this is talking about Daniel's attitude. And I think that's one of the things that made Daniel so appealing to so many of these rulers. Is not only was he skilled, not only was he able to do the job they wanted him to do, but he was actually easy to get along with. How many of you have ever had a coworker that wasn't too easy to get along with? They may be able to do their job, but they're not really easy to get along with. We have a deacon at Decatur Highway, and I won't name him, and I won't name the company that he works for. But we go out to eat on occasion, and he always has a story about a coworker that in the middle of these meetings that they will have, group meetings, this coworker will kind of abuse somebody or berate somebody or tear somebody down or complain about something that's going on. He said he never has anything good to say. He never has anything positive to add to the meeting. It's always negative, and it's always tearing somebody else down. Nobody likes working with the guy. And we've all met people like that. People like that generally don't get ahead. Generally, people figure them out, and they don't want to have too much to do with them. And so Daniel was a guy that had a good attitude, a good spirit, and I think it was one of those things that enabled him to excel in the way that he did. I like to put it this way: Daniel was a man of principle and pathos who focused on God's glory, not the political circumstances. Now, there's a whole lot in that statement. He was a man of principle and pathos. In other words, he didn't bend on what he believed, but he was able to convey what he believed in such a way that regardless of the political circumstances he was serving in, everybody focused on God. Now that is skill. That is something that every single one of us needs to try to develop. And so it should be noted that at this particular time, or we'll note at least right now, at this particular time, Daniel is believed to be about 90 years old, at least in excess of 80 years old. This is not young Daniel that we're introduced to at the beginning of the book. This is old Daniel. He had been down the road a little bit. He had experienced a lot, and now he still had a great influence in the nation. And I'm always astounded when I read about biblical characters that at an advanced age, they were doing extraordinary things. Moses was 80 when he led the people of Israel out of Egypt and through the wilderness. Caleb was 85 when he said, "Give me this mountain and I'll defeat those giants that are up there." In more modern history, did you realize Thomas Edison was 80 or 90 years old when he invented the light bulb? Or at least was credited with inventing the light bulb. Frank Lloyd Wright was 90 when he gained his greatest success as an architect. Shaw was writing plays at the age of 90. Grandma Moses was painting at the age of 80. And J.C. Penney was working strenuously in his office at the age of 95. These days we get to 55 or 60 and we're going, "Well, I'm ready to retire. Let me kick back. Let me enjoy life." These people were doing great things all through their lives. And they were accomplishing things. And most importantly, with Daniel and with Moses and with Caleb, they were accomplishing things for God. Let's never forget that. I don't care how old you are, you have the ability to accomplish great things for God. And if you will develop proper principles and you will exhibit great pathos toward others, you can and you will accomplish great things for God. So that's the promotion. The next word I want to give you is the word plot. We're going to move a little bit quicker as we go through this. Verses 4 through 9, we read about the plot. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. That's according to verse 4. Someone has noted that when a man is lifted up, particularly by God in this situation, but when a man is lifted up, when a man finds certain prominence and certain success, there are always difficulties that go along with it. There's a price to pay. Now that's going to be true no matter what. Even if people love you, even if people like you, there's a price to pay for success. If you're a pianist, there are going to be a lot of hours sitting in front of that piano, practicing and rehearsing. If you're an artist, you're going to be fastened to your canvas. If you're a poet, then it's your lyric that you're constantly going to be working on. If you're an author, you're always working on a manuscript, editing and rewriting and so forth. If you're a theologian, you're deep in your studies. If you're a physician, you're focused on your patients and upon studies that help you take care of your patients. Anybody and everybody that excels in any area is going to pay a price for that. But then there's the added problem that sometimes when somebody becomes successful in a particular area, there are always those people who are going to be bitten by the bug of jealousy and envy. And they're going to try to tear you down. You can't possibly be that successful and be honest. You can't possibly do that good a work and be doing it the right way. And they're constantly going to be looking for something that is going to discredit you. Paul was familiar with this. Philippians chapter 1, you remember Paul tells us beginning in verse 15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry. And he goes on in verse 17 to say, out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking they afflict me in my imprisonment. They were preaching the gospel. Not to help Paul, not to spread the gospel, not to do good for the gospel, but to hurt Paul. They were envious, and they wanted to bring him down. And it's amazing how when God lifts somebody up, like a Daniel, like a Paul, how other people's hearts will burn in rage. And they want to do nothing but to tear that individual down. So in verse 4, when we read these words, these presidents, these princes, these 120 satraps that had been appointed, that they wanted to find something against Daniel. But they had a problem. Daniel didn't have any water gates. You got to be a little older to know that one. But Daniel didn't have any skeletons in his closet. He didn't have anything they could get a hold of. He didn't have anything that they could kind of sink their teeth into. There was nothing there to indict the man. Daniel is a perfect example, I think, of what Paul meant in 1 Timothy chapter 3 when he said that a bishop, an elder, an overseer should be blameless. Not that he's perfect. As a sidelight, Daniel is one of the few people in the Bible that were never told one single sin he committed. We know he committed some, but we're not told about them. But that's just a sidelight. But Daniel kept himself so well for God that even if he had done something wrong, nobody would believe it. My wife's grandmother was the sweetest woman I've ever met. And we've sat around sometimes and had the discussion, did she ever sin? I mean, you know, the whole family, okay, bring out your notebook and bring out your memory book and let's say, did she ever sin? Now, well, there was this one time in nope, that wasn't a sin either. You know, we're trying to figure out, she really was a genuinely sweet, holy, pure woman, as much as anybody I've ever known in my entire life. But I know she sinned, because we all do. I know Daniel sinned, but he lived his life so that none of those sins stuck to him. What a commendation. What a way to live your life. And so verses 6 and 7 go on to describe how that these counselors went to Darius and they convinced him that he needed to make this edict that nobody could utter a petition to any god for an entire month, that they had to bring everything to Darius. They had to bring everything to the king. You've heard the phrase, queen for a day? They essentially were offering him God for a month. They were saying, you can be God. Everybody has to bring everything to you. They can't pray to any other gods. They can't petition any other gods. Otherwise, there's going to be a stiff penalty. Now, they're playing here on Daniel's goodness, on what they knew Daniel was all about. And so they put this into place. They deceived the king. They appealed to his pride. They flattered him. You know, other people do this. The Egyptians looked at the pharaohs as if they were gods. The Romans looked at the Caesars as if they were gods. The Ptolemies believed that they were gods. And you can go on through history and you see that those who ruled great kingdoms, particularly for any given period of time, that ultimately they came to believe that in some way they had to be a god. There's a danger of being a ruler. And so they convinced Darius, you can be the same thing. If not forever, at least for the next 30 days. And that's really all they needed. Because Daniel was going to do what Daniel did. And that brings up the next word, and that's perseverance. In verse 10, we learn that as soon as this law went into place, Daniel knew that the document had been signed, and he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. There's the key phrase. That's how they knew what they could do. They knew exactly what Daniel was going to do. And I don't know if they were sitting in the bushes at 6 a.m. in the morning waiting for him to, light a candle and start praying, or if they just thought, well, we know he prays 3 times a day, so we can walk by there just about any time and we'll catch him doing exactly what he did. And it's interesting that Daniel really did not try to hide this. Some of us might even ask the question, well, why didn't Daniel just close his window? Why didn't Daniel just, do it a little bit more secretively? Jesus said, go into your closet and pray. Why did Daniel have to open the windows? Why did he have to do what he had done before and give them an opportunity? We see there's a fine line there. Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees because of their pride and their displays of religiosity that they would perform. He wasn't necessarily rebuking someone who had a common practice of going to God on a regular basis, not to be seen by people, but this is just the way that I do it. It's interesting, the text says he had his windows open toward Jerusalem. He was a man who grew up in exile, who had lived the better part of his adult life in exile. He probably could not remember very much Jerusalem itself. But he longed for Jerusalem. And he prayed every day with those windows open toward Jerusalem. Now the pattern that he had probably was established by David. Psalm 55 tells us, morning, noon, and night, he fell on his knees to pray. So every morning, every day at noon, and every evening, he would get on his knees and he would pray. And that's what these men knew that he would do. Now, if he had changed this at all, it might have indicated that perhaps he didn't trust God as much as he had purported to trust God. Couldn't he have just cooled it for 30 days? Couldn't he have just done it a little less visible? Couldn't he have done it a different way? But any compromise that he would have given would have been read as self-serving and a dent in his character. It would have given a foothold to his enemies. And Daniel could not and would not afford that. The story told of a bishop in Smyrna in AD 155 by the name of Polycarp, that when he was arrested by the Roman soldiers, and he was so beloved in the city, even the Roman soldiers loved him, and they begged and pled with him, said, just say that Caesar is Lord and we'll let you go. Just one simple statement, just say it one time, we'll let you go. Polycarp's response to them as they were tying him to the stake they would burn him at was, 86 years have I served my Lord and he has never failed me. Neither will I fail him now. Now that's commitment and that's dedication. And that's the kind of man that Daniel was. The next word that we want to take a look at is the word prosecution. Naturally, once they got the evidence, they went to the king, they presented it before the king, and they showed him this is exactly what we knew Daniel would do. And so the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions, just as the law said was going to happen. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. One commentator said, well, there were only a few, and Daniel found a corner and hid. Talking about the lions. You see, detractors of the Bible have tried to get around this whole thing in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of humorous sometimes to read some of the excuses that they will give as to what was taking place. Some will say, well, there really were just a couple of lions. And Daniel just kind of went and hid in the corner, and the lions didn't realize he was there, and so he was able to escape unharmed. But no, this was a big place, and generally in the lions' dens, there would be a lot of lions because they used these as places of execution. And they wanted the execution to take place quickly. And so these lions were hungry. They wanted blood. They wanted to get to the victim as quickly as they possibly could. And a lot of times there would be sort of a window that would peer down into the den where the governors or the rulers could watch what was going on, sort of get some sport out of what was taking place. And no doubt that's probably what was happening here. One of the more famous and popular commentators on the Old Testament, a man by the name of Kyle, says concerning this den, it consisted of a large square cavern under the earth, having a partition wall in the middle of it, which is furnished with a door, which the keeper can open and close from above. But throwing in the food, he entices the lions from one chamber into the other, and then having shut the door, they enter the vacant space for the purpose of cleansing it. In other words, anything in there is going to get eaten. The cavern is open above, its mouth being surrounded by a wall of 1.5 yards high, over which one can look down into the den. Now notice the language of Darius at this particular point in verse 16. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will, what's the next word? Deliver you. How did he know that? How did he have a concept of God delivering Daniel? Except that Daniel had already taught him these lessons. Daniel had already had these conversations with Darius. Daniel probably had been around Darius at this point, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, according to some timelines on the book. But nonetheless, they had already had these conversations. Darius probably had heard the story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace. And so it was known what Daniel's God could and would do. And even though, just like happened when Jesus was sealed in the tomb, they brought a stone, they covered the opening to the mouth of the den, verse 17 tells us, and the king sealed it with his signet ring. At that point, there was no changing what was going to happen. It was all up to God. That leads us to our next word, and that's preservation. In verse 18, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. It's interesting how subtle the Holy Spirit is at this point. Instead of focusing on Daniel and what might be happening in that lion's den. I mean, don't you want to know what was happening in the lion's den, what Daniel was doing at this particular point? The text never tells us. The text focuses on the king. The text tells us what the king was doing. And he didn't have any dancers, he didn't have any performers, he didn't have food and banquet and all of that come in to kind of take his mind off of what was going on. No, he sat in quiet and he contemplated what was happening every moment of every hour. And early the next morning he rose and he ran to the den. Some scholars have suggested that Darius at this time probably was about 60, 62 years old. So he wasn't a young man, but he literally ran in an open sprint to get to the den. And then when he gets there, verse 20 tells us, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? And then verse 22 is the beautiful verse here. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Angels are powerful. We read one account where one angel killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night. I mean, angels can do stuff. This angel came and he stopped the mouths of the lions. Probably means not only their mouths, but their claws too. They could have easily ripped him to shreds, even if they couldn't open their mouths. But basically, he calmed the lions. He kept them away from Daniel so that Daniel would be safe. You know how you're innocent? You know how to know that you're innocent? When, of course you couldn't, Siri. I don't even know where Siri is, goodness. She talks to me every once in a while. I never get lonely, Siri's always there. But you know how to tell when you're innocent? When God says you're innocent. When God says you're innocent, you're innocent. And Daniel could have been judged for a lot of things. At this particular moment, this particular time, God could have allowed a lot of things to happen to Daniel. Daniel was innocent. And God didn't allow anything to happen. Reminds me a little bit of Job in Job chapter 1, when God says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" That's the kind of man Daniel was. So that leads us to the next word, and that's punishment. And it's 5 till, so I really got to rip through this real quick. The last 2 points are pretty short, so we're in good shape. But in verse 24, then after he brings Daniel out of the den, guess what happens? The people who accused Daniel and their families, their wives, their children, everybody, got thrown into the den. Now here's the point where detractors of the Bible, they say, well, the lions were well fed and they weren't hungry. They were hungry. Now, that wasn't Siri. I don't know what that was. Somebody's trying to tell me something. But they were hungry, and they tore these people to shreds in just a moment's time. Not just one person or 2 people, not a handful of people, but this was a large group of people. And these lions took care of them in a short time. They were not like, as the old cartoon lion Clarence, who was the cross-eyed lion, they weren't old, they weren't toothless, they weren't well-fed. These were lions. These were lions that wanted to eat people. And that's exactly what they did at this moment. And then the chapter ends with prosperity. Because in the very last verse of the chapter, we learn that this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so we have these kings that Daniel continued to flourish under. First Nebuchadnezzar and his descendants, and then Darius, and then Cyrus, and on he would go as he was serving these people. Now, what was it about Daniel? I want to give you just a few things, and it won't be on the screen. But verse 3 tells us he had a good attitude. Verse 4 tells us that he was faithful. Verse 10 tells us he was consistent. Verse 16 says that he had a heart of service. Verse 21 says that he was respectful and honoring of the king, and it didn't matter which king it was. And verse 23 says that he trusted in God. That's what made Daniel who Daniel was. Now, I wanted to end with 5 lessons, and these are going to be quick. Number 1, we learn attitude determines destiny. It says that at the very outset when Daniel was appointed as one of these governors over the 120 satraps. It was because he had an excellent spirit. If you have a good attitude, you can go a lot of places. And we all need to work on our attitude. I'll admit sometimes I don't have the greatest attitude. Things are trying to sabotage me all over on this one. Sometimes I don't have the best attitude. I realize I need to work on my attitude. A man with a good attitude can go a long way. Second lesson, the key to innocence, faithfulness. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to be faithful. And if you're faithful, people can overlook a lot of faults. People will overlook a lot of faults if you are faithful and you are true. Number 3, never leave off prayer. Even in a difficult time, even when people may frown upon it, don't ever forget to pray. There is never a bad time to pray. And Daniel knew he needed to pray. Even if the king said, don't do it, he was going to do it. The 4th lesson, God will deliver. We don't always know how God will deliver. We don't always know when God will deliver, but rest assured, God will deliver. His eye is on his children, and he is going to deliver them. And the final lesson I want you to see is God's indestructible kingdom. This is the amazing thing to me. As all of these events come to an end, and Darius begins to comment on the day. Look at the words of Darius. These aren't Daniel's words. These are the words of Darius. For he is the living God, enduring forever. This is verse 26. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. That's something that he recognized. God will always rule. God will always be in charge. And that really is the great theme of the book of Daniel, that God rules in the kingdoms of men. I don't care who's in the White House. I don't care who's ruling Russia or China or North Korea or Great Britain or any other nation of the world. The one thing I know is God rules in the kingdoms of men, and his kingdom is indestructible. You can't do anything to destroy what God has put into place. So the question is, do you want to be a lion in a den full of Daniels? Or do you want to be a Daniel? Do you want to craft your life, live your life in such a way that people can know who you are, they can respect who you are, they can depend on who you are, and you can lead people, even the rulers of men, like Nebuchadnezzar, like Darius, that you can lead these people to have respect and honor for the God of heaven. That's who Daniel was. That's what Daniel did. That's why these lions were lockjawed. And you can lockjaw the devil every single day of your life if you lose yourself to the living God and you live faithfully to him. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, the first step in that is to give your life to Jesus Christ. Trust him with all of your heart and turn to him by way of repentance. Confess his beautiful name before men and submit yourself to be immersed into him to rise and walk in newness of life. That's how you can begin that walk with him. And if you're here and you've already been baptized, but you've let things of the world maybe attract you and pull you in different directions, and you've forgotten to be a Daniel in the middle of the world, you can come to him and he will forgive you of all of your trespasses. 1 John 1 and verse 9. If you confess your sins, and he will forgive you, and you can live a life like Daniel, if only you will give yourself to him. The invitation's open to you tonight. And if you would obey him, won't you come while together we stand and sing.